Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be doing an in-depth analysis of what would happen if the midterm elections happened today. So, without further ado, let's get into it here. Again, please do like and subscribe please like the video, please subscribe to the channel if you are not already, and yeah, let's get into it here. So, there are some states that would not really be in play again. Some states are going to be very solid for both parties, meaning that they're going to go a certain way by more than 15%, so they're not really competitive. These states are Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, and Vermont for the Democrats. The Republicans of these states are Idaho, the Dakotas, Utah, Alaska, because there are only really two Republicans running there, Kansas, both Oklahoma races, although there have been some interesting polls there, but I'm not really ready to move it down just yet. Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, and South Carolina. Now, the remaining 11 seats are competitive to some degree. Again, some like Colorado and New Hampshire are not really that competitive. Again, if you take a look at the polls out of the Senate races, we'll look at Colorado first. Michael Bennet, the Democrats, up by 9%. In New Hampshire, the polls are currently showing a margin of victory for Mackie Hassan, the Democrat, by about 7.3%. I think that these margins will be pretty accurate. They could be a little too low on Republicans, but either way, will not really be that much margin for a Republican to come in and win those seats. Now, for the Republicans, they've got a few of these seats too. Iowa, Florida are the first ones that come to mind. Again, Iowa, the polls are now showing a very solid Republican lead. Chuck Grassley beating Michael Franken by 7.3% in the state where the polls underestimated Trump by 6%. He's going to win re-election fairly easily. In Florida, Marco Rubio right now leading Val Demings by 4%, and I don't really see a path to the Democrats in either of these states. Now, Ohio's interesting because right now the polls in Ohio actually show a very tight race with J.D. Vance actually trailing Democrat Tim Ryan. Now, that being said, the polls in Ohio tend to underestimate Democratic Republican support by a lot. They had Biden within a point of winning it in 2020. He lost by 8. So again, I don't think the error will be necessarily that big this time, and I do think the polls will move towards Vance by election day. But either way, if the election were held today in Ohio, I think it would be just under a 5-point margin of victory for Tim Ryan, with undecided voters ranking maybe a little more towards him than they will on election day. Now, North Carolina, similar thing. Democrats, North Carolina, to win the state have to do very good with do very well with black voters, and I don't think that they're fully ready for that just yet. Again, they still need to have better turn operations than they've had in the past, and right now, not necessarily something I'd bet on. It's very possible, but again, the polls do show Bud up by a point in a state where the polls showed Biden up by 2 and he lost by 2. So, I think Bud's going to end up winning by about a point or so more than Donald Trump, and that's what the polls show, and I think if the election were held today, he might need to win by closer to 4%. Now, for our lean Democratic states, the first state that comes to mind here is Arizona. The polls in Arizona have not really been that close. They are showing a very solid lead for the Democratic Party right now. Mark Kelly beating Blake Masters by 7.4% in the polls. Now, again, in 2020, the polls did undershoot Trump by about 2.5 in Arizona, so you can add that to Blake Masters for that margin here. And yeah, it's fair to say that some of the undecideds will come home to Blake Masters, but again, Kelly nearing 50%, don't really see an alley or really an avenue for Masters as things stand today. Again, we still have 6 weeks to go, but if the election were held today, it's pretty clear to me that Masters would lose by a couple of points. In Pennsylvania, same thing with John Fetterman and Dr. Oz. Fetterman has led in every single poll. Again, it's very rare to win a race where you're behind in all the polls, especially in a state that we've had a ton of polling like Pennsylvania. It's not like we only have 2 polls. We have 30, 40 polls here, and they all are showing the same thing, which is a Fetterman lead. Again, Insider Advantage had Trump winning Pennsylvania in 2020, they now have Fetterman winning. Trafalgar had Trump winning Pennsylvania, they now have Fetterman winning, and overall, the more nonpartisan polls have him up. He's up by 7% in the average. I think it'll be less. I think it'll be closer to 3 or 4 if it were held today, but that being said, I do think Fetterman would win if the election were held today by a pretty good amount for a Democrat in a state as close as Pennsylvania usually is. Georgia, I'm not ready to touch Georgia just yet, but I think I'm going to go to Wisconsin here next. Wisconsin right now, as you can see, is very close in the polls, but again, you have to remember, Johnson being up half a point actually is probably very good for him, and polls in Wisconsin tend to underestimate Republican support by a lot. Biden was up by 1% at election. Biden won by 1% on election day 2020. He was up by 8% in the polls, so that's a 7% error. And then in 2016, Trump was down by I think 6% in the polls. He won by a point. So we had 7% errors in both 2016 and 2020. There's no reason to believe they're fixed until they're fixed, and I think ultimately we'd see a 4 or 5 point victory for Ron Johnson if it were held today. Now, going over to our final 2 states, these are the 2 tallest states. These starting to determine control of the Senate. Where do I stand on these states? Well, the first state I want to get to is Georgia. Georgia, again, Democrats need really good turnout operations with black voters, which I don't think they're at yet. Again, they still need time in these final weeks to execute that turnout operation. That being said, the Republicans need time for their turnout operation as well. And the fact that Warnock's up by 2% in a state where the polls actually underestimated him in 2021 shows he's in a strong position. I think he'd win by a similar amount if the election were held today. In Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto seems to be doing decently well again. She was originally expected to be a big underdog heading into the year, but she's held fairly strong again. She's still a toss race. She could still absolutely lose, but she's up by a point in the polls. And yes, in 2020, the polls in Nevada tend to underestimate Republicans, but in 2018, Adam Laxalt, the Republican candidate for Senate, lost his governor's race despite being up in the polls. And Dean Heller was winning the Senate race, or was tied the Senate race in the polls, and he lost by 5%. So, 2020 may be an example of the polls in Nevada being weird towards Democrats, but in 2018, 2016, and 2012, they were all the other way. So this is what the Senate map would look like, I think, if the election were to be held today. Again, these aren't my final predictions, but if it were held today, this is what I think would happen. Now, governor's map. The first thing that I think we'll get out of the way of the safe Democratic states, these are California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, both of which are pickups because we have incumbent Republican governors retiring. New York, as well as... Nope, that's actually it. Now, for our Republican states, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, although there have been some close polls out of Oklahoma, but again, don't want to read too much into those because polls in Oklahoma tend to be very weird. Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Iowa, Ohio, as well as Vermont, New Hampshire, which again are Democratic-leaning states federally, but they have Republican governors who are very popular. Moderate Republicans, liberal Republicans, one might even call them. They will do very well. Now, for our likely Democratic states, first that comes to mind here is Colorado. Again, polls in Colorado have been, showing a very strong result for the Democratic governor, Jared Polis. As of right now, Polis leads Heidi Gaynell as the Republican challenger by about 13.5%, which is the exact margin Biden was up by in Colorado. I expect Polis to win by a similar amount to that. Next up is Minnesota. Minnesota likely to be very strong for Tim Walz, the incumbent Democrat. Right now, as you can see, he leads by almost 10%. In 2020, the polls tended to underestimate Trump by a couple of points in Minnesota, but really, Tim Walz being up by more than Biden did this point is very strong for him. And the better polls have had him winning by double digits. So looks like he's going to be doing fairly well here. Michigan, next up, Gretchen Whitmer. She's up by even more than Tim Walz in Michigan. She is winning by over 12%. I don't think it'll be that big of a margin. I don't even think it'll be that big of a margin if the election were held today, but clearly Republicans have not had the time to get behind Tuta Dixon. They haven't had the time to really fundraise for her or get her any sort of ground game going, and that's really going to hurt her both now and in November. And I think if the election were held today, she'd lose by 6%. Could narrow up before November, but I still don't really see a path for her at this point in time. Next up are the states of Connecticut, Rhode Island. Not too much to talk about here. Again, polls are showing Democrats winning both these races by double digits. It's worth noting that the Democratic there's a bit of a candidate disparity here in Rhode Island. The Democratic governor, Dan McKee, who won his primary only very narrowly, is not super popular. He'll probably win re-election by around 10%, which would be, still a solid margin, but not a particularly impressive margin for a Democrat in Rhode Island. In Connecticut, Bob Stefanowski, the Republican candidate, likely to outperform Trump just because Connecticut's much more Republican down ballot. Maine, finally, the state was originally considered to be very competitive as former Republican Governor Paul LePage was running, but as you can see now, polls just have not shown any really movement towards Republicans here. Janet Mills up by 9% in the state of Maine, much bigger than her lead of 4% back in the summer. And as you can see, the Emerson and UNH have her up by 11 and 14 respectively. It looks like she's going to win re-election by a larger than anticipated margin there. Now, for our likely Republican states, first that comes to mind is Alaska. There's a ranked choice voting system there, which makes things a bit more complicated, but Democrats should still probably prepare for defeat in Alaska. Again, the polls do show Mike Dunleavy winning re-election there. He's the incumbent Republican. He will likely win. In Texas, I think we're going to see a similar thing with Greg Abbott. There's a very, very small chance that this race, goes down to the wire. But at the end of the day, Texas likely to stay Republican here because right now Abbott is ahead by 7.5% in the polling average. And we've gotten a lot of polls here. Some of them have showed it kind of close, but in reality, does not look like it's going to actually be anything too competitive here. Abbott up by 7 in the most recent poll from Quinnipiac, up by 8 in Emerson, up by 7 in Siena, up by 9 in UT Tyler. Looks like he's going to win by high single digits when it's all said and done. Now, next up is the state of Florida. Florida, and we'll throw in all these other states here: Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. Again, starting with Florida, Ron DeSantis is not unpopular enough to lose in a state like Florida. It's a Republican-leaning state. It's in a more Republican-leaning year than 2020. Especially, in 2020, the polls underestimated Trump by 5% in Florida. The fact that DeSantis is up by 5.6% just goes to show that he's likely to do very, very well. On election night, he can probably win by high single digits. Georgia, Brian Kemp, right now running a really strong campaign for re-election. He's up by 6%, even more than Florida, Ben DeSantis in Florida. And while the polls in Georgia tend to be like very accurate, have a narrow bias towards the Republicans, but are very accurate, I think this is a pretty good guess. I think 10 plus 6 is where we are as of right now. Then finally, in South Carolina, Joe Cunningham is a Democratic nominee, former congressman from a swing district in the eastern part of the state. He's a good candidate, and McMaster is necessarily the best incumbent Republican governor, but at the end of the day, we haven't really had any polling that showed it's particularly close. Cunningham's own internal has him down by 7, and as of right now, it doesn't look like this is really anywhere near close to toss-up. So I think it'll go Republican by around 12 to 13%, and if it were held today, that's how it would go. Now, lean Democratic states, starting with Oregon. It's interesting because it's kind of a three-way race between the independent Betsy Johnson, the Democrat Tina Kotek, and the Republican Christine Drawson. As you can see right now, the polls have been really weird. Right now they have Kotek up by 1.5, Drawson at 31%, and Johnson at 22%. But again, one of these polls is actually a Johnson internal that has, her at 31 in rally. She'll probably get close to 10 to 15% of the vote. And she'll likely siphon away a fair amount of votes from both parties, in such a way that the winner of this race will probably only get like 45% of the vote. That being said, or maybe even 40% of the vote. That being said, I think the Democrats, it's a blue-leaning state. The Democrats clearly have somewhat of an advantage here. In the state of Pennsylvania, that's our next lean D state. Pennsylvania, and also New Mexico. So Pennsylvania, to get started here, polls have been really good for Democrats. Doug Mastriano, the Republican, has essentially no money to spend or advertise or really get out any sort of turnout operation. So at this point, him winning would be very, very hard to really see. Josh Spears, the Attorney General of the state, he's, a popular figure. He outran Biden by 4% in 2020. And yeah, the polls in Pennsylvania have been off in the past, but not off by nearly enough to even get Mastriano within striking distance of Shapiro. So at this point, it looks like he's headed for a 5-point loss in Pennsylvania. In New Mexico, originally I thought this race was actually going to go very narrowly towards the Republicans, but as the campaign has progressed, it's become clear that Ron Chetty's not running as good of a campaign as expected. Again, he hasn't really hit Michelle Lujan Grisham as much on her scandal as one would have expected, and he's only led in one poll, and it's his own internal. And other than that, all the nonpartisan polls have Michelle Lujan Grisham winning. So right now, looks like Lujan Grisham would narrowly win her race. And yeah, so that's our lean Democratic states. Lean Republican states, the election were to be held today. I think the first would be Arizona. Again, Arizona is a state that has been really disappointing for Democrats because Katie Hobbs was originally expected to kind of beat out Carrie Lake here, but the polls have just shown too tight of a race. And again, the polls overestimated Biden by nearly 3% in 2020. Hobbs being only up by a point is a bad sign for her, especially if you consider that even in the polls where Kelly's up big, she still can only narrowly find leads, and that's very concerning for her against Carrie Lake. And ultimately, unless undecideds break massively towards Katie Hobbs, I think if the election will be held tomorrow, I think she'd lose by about 2%, which is, again, very disappointing for the Arizona Democrats because that was a very winnable race for them. Now, in Wisconsin, I think there will be a similar thing. Tony Evers is not the most popular governor. He's, actually in the negatives in net approval. And Tim Michels is a decent challenger. He's not the best, but he's, still, running a fairly strong campaign against Tony Evers. Again, Evers is a fine, candidate. He's not super popular, but he's not popular enough to, I think, hold on in a state like Wisconsin in an environment like this. So as of right now, he is currently leading by 2%. I think he's going to lose by, 2 to 3%. Again, the polls in Wisconsin have been really bad. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the polls, Wisconsin had Biden winning the state by nearly 8%. He only won by a point. And the fact that Arizona's only up by 2 right now, not very good for him. So Wisconsin narrowly going to Tim Michels. And then finally, these are our 2 toss-up states. I think I'm going to split them here. I think I'm going to give Nevada to the Democrats and Kansas to the GOP, although, again, both these states will be very close. Again, Nevada is really just a game of turnout and how much the Republicans would be able to turn out their voters on election day. Because I think if the election were to be held right now, Cortez Masto having a big cash advantage and having been able to to kind of out blitz Laxalt on the airwaves helps Democrats in the Senate race, and I think that carries over to the governor's race. Steve Sisolak's not, I think, a bad enough incumbent to lose big. So as right now, I think you win re-election by about a point. And then in Kansas, Laura Kelly, a very strong Democratic incumbent, but she's in a red state, and Derek Schmidt is a good challenger. And ultimately, at the end of the day, Democrats in Kansas are going to have to do very well with both the suburbs and the urban areas, and also cut into the Republican margins with rural voters. I just don't see that happening quite yet. So that's, I think, what would happen in the governor's race if it were held today. Now, again, this is not my final prediction. This is actually not what I'm even predicting right now, but I think if they were held today or tomorrow, this is what I think would happen. So that's the governor's map. Again, I'll go back to the Senate map here, but thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next one. Bye.